Just next to her is another Mary. But this time round, we have a weather woman in studio, Mary Kilavi, Assistant Director, the Kenya Meteorological Department. Ladies, karibuni sana.
Thank you.
First things first, I'm quite sure you did see the news, Mary, yesterday, where we saw the president flagging off 50 trucks that have food reserves to be taken to some of the worst hit counties in the country. And something that is not unique in Kenya, I should say. We have seen president after president do the same thing each and every year. And the situation now is a little bit critical, looking at the failed rains, and we have over 40 years, we have not experienced such kind of drought. I would like to pick your mind on what crosses your mind when you see each and every year we have to give out food, and it's a situation that is getting critical each and every day.
Okay, thank you very much. I think, as you have mentioned, the country is concerned, the government is concerned about the situation, but I want to put this in context. We find that Kenya and the Horn of Africa has been experiencing a lot of shocks. From 2019 up to now, we have seen the shock of locusts, we have seen the COVID-19 pandemic, then we have seen the drought. Now, it has been observed that actually, historically, we've been having droughts over every 10 years. But now these droughts have become closer in terms of the intervals. And this is attributed to climate change. Climate change is a phenomenon that is affecting many parts of the world, not just Kenya. So it's very important that we look into ways in which we can work around it, and the government is very keen, as we have mentioned, to see which ways we can help our people so that they don't die of hunger. We have various issues that we are faced with. We are having people who don't even have water, don't have food, don't have proper nutrition. So it's very important that we work together with the government. All stakeholders have to contribute so that we can make an impact in solving this problem of drought, food security and nutrition.
Yes, and Mary, looking at July, 19.4 million people in the Horn of Africa were affected. That is July. And as early as this month, 36 million people in the Horn of Africa, 24.1 million in Ethiopia, 7.8 million in Somalia, and 4 million Kenyans are in dire need of food. And from your department, the latest prediction that you had is that we are going to be having suppressed rainfalls in our short rains that are scheduled to begin anytime in October.
Yes, that's very true and very unfortunate that dire as the situation is. The focus is actually there's very good consensus among the models that we are going into another drought that will make it the 5th consecutive drought, and yeah, it's likely going to be catastrophic.
And what can you tell Kenyans? Because at the end of the day, Kenyans are preparing. They're tilling their land to ensure that as soon as the rains come, they are not caught flat-footed. But unfortunately, the rains will be suppressed.
Yes, given that we're expecting inadequate rainfall, then it's very important that the farmers actually ask or rather work quite closely with the Ministry of Agriculture so that they get to know what are the best management practices given the expected deficient rainfall, and also what technologies they could use, what innovations they could use, because it's looking rather definite that it's going to be another failed season. Yes.
Prof, you're a distinguished scientist, and you have conducted pioneer researches in Africa, more specifically in African indigenous vegetables. Kindly tell us something about that, because at the end of the day, if we are going to be having suppressed rainfalls, then we have to look at the crops that do not really need a lot of rain.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the most important aspect that we need to look into with the information that there will be less rainfall during this short period is to diversify production, because many of us in Kenya and many parts of Africa, we look at some of the key crops like maize, rice, and other cereals. But at this point in time, it will be very important to start looking into short-term crops. Like in this case, we should not just plant maize, we should plant crops that can can be harvested in a short time. We talk about vegetables, we're talking about beans, we're talking about crops that within 2-3 months or with less than a month you have some product. So we should not just plant maize. We encourage the farmers to have diversified production so that we also include in our production indigenous foods, because of late there's been an interest and a lot of information has come out that some of these indigenous crops have resilient characteristics that they can do well even with less rainfall.
And looking at the weather patterns in the last 5 years, because of basically or largely because of our human activities here on Earth, and more specifically the West, who have really made the climate a nightmare. The farmers that there's a good thing Prof has talked about. That is something that we should be looking at, and especially telling the farmers, as the meteorological department. Yes, there are going to be suppressed rainfalls. What can you advise in terms of farmers?
One thing that is key, in addition to what Prof has said, because the fact that the rainfall is going to be inadequate does not mean that it won't rain at all. So it would be very important to actually harvest as much water as possible so that they can supplement the rain-fed agriculture with a bit of irrigation from the harvested water. So that's one thing that's really important. One other thing that they could do is make use of our regular updates, because on a day-to-day, weekly basis, we give updates as to what is expected. So if they make use of the regular updates, then they will get to know when is it that we expect maybe a lot of water which they could harvest within that short period.
Prof, looking at the drought situation we have in the country, unfortunately we have a big divide. At times right now we have the drought, but when the rains falls, they really pour. We have floods, unfortunately. And Mary will be telling us about the storms and flash floods that was in the report that we were going to be experiencing some places will be experiencing some storm, some places will be experiencing some flash floods, and what we can do in regards to that. Somebody yesterday said that the drought situation and the way we look at it in Kenya is quite disturbing, because droughts were there even in biblical time, in the times of where the king would, for 7 years, would be drought, and the 7 years will be having a plentiful, 7 years will be having a big drought. We had floods from the times of Noah, but unfortunately, as developing countries, we have not read these signs, or we have not read the Bible well, because this is something that happens each and every year. We have even developed countries, chipping in with food and fertilizer just for free. But unfortunately, the rains come and we do not do sufficient. When they go, we are in the situation that we are in right now.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think in this particular aspect, it is very important for the country, farmers, and even counties to plan. What I mean is that when there is floods, when there's a lot of rain, we have technologies that have been developed, what we do, water harvesting. These technologies need to be practiced so that if there's plenty of water, it is you harvest the water. We have several of those technologies, like you can do underground storage or any other storage, so that when now it is a drought season, you can now do the irrigation, so that we are not just depending on rain-fed agriculture. Two, just like you have referred to the biblical story, when the rains are there and we have plenty of harvest, we need to go into what we are calling post-harvest handling, and just trying to process such a way that we can store these crops. Because you see, when you have so much, for example, let me just give an example of vegetables. When you have the vegetables, you grow a lot of them, they are perishable. So you dry them. You have the drying technologies. You dry in such a way that these vegetables, when they are dried in a way that you don't deplete the nutrient content, you can be able to use during what we call the periods of scarcity, when you have maybe the drought. And then secondly, in Kenya, some areas are very productive, only 20%. 80% of the areas we are talking about is a drought. So we can even now have these drought vegetables processed, being transported to the those areas. Those are some of the issues that we need to do. Next, I want to talk about what we call precision agriculture. Precision agriculture is where you have that water you have harvested and you put it where it is needed. We have those technologies. Even a small-scale farmer will just put the water where it is needed. So those are and then we have also the government, especially CALRO and Ministry of Agriculture, have been talking about what we call smart agriculture. Smart agriculture means that you maximize on the input so that you are not wasting water, you're not wasting any inputs. So those are the technologies from where I see that can be harvested. These technologies are there. Yes, they just need to be put in place or they are practiced. The farmers just need to be re-educated. This is what we have, and each farmer can do it at a household level, and the country can adopt now the irrigation system where they have to store this water and then it's used during the time of a drought. Yes.
Mary, I'm looking at the Kenyan situation and trying to more or less put it side by side with the biblical tale, because my thinking is, if we are if we had a Kenya Meteorological Department back in Noah's day, it is the one which was mandated to tell Noah that there's going to be a lot of rain, and Noah had his ark. In the same way, the Kenya Meteorological Department, if it was back then, it would have spoken to Joseph in the dream and tell him the 7 years, so there's going to be plenty of food, and then 7 years there's going to be a lot of drought. And those two gentlemen did heed to that call. But here in Kenya, we are told that they're going to be suppressed rainfall. We're going to be having the worst drought in recent years. But unfortunately, what we have is flagging of relief food. Does it not disturb you? And in your prediction, you talked about storms and flash floods. This is something that we can harness, because these rains are going to be there for what, like 3 months, October, November, and December. And then in January, we have a dry season again. We are having 4 million Kenyans who need food, and the suppressed rainfall cannot be doing anything justice to these people. We are experiencing something that is unprecedented.
Yeah, indeed. To the extent possible, we should really avoid getting to this point, and that could be best done by making use of the forecast. The last seasons, most of them have been very well predicted and early enough. So we should move from being proactive to being, we should move from being reactive to being proactive. And that means that as much as our predictions are not 100% accurate, like the Bible prophecies you've talked about, they still have sufficient skill, especially for the short rain season, to work with. So we can actually rely on the forecasts, especially for the short rain season, to take action before we get to where we are. And that would actually, to a good extent, minimize the impacts that we are now experiencing. Yes.
Prof, we are looking at a situation where Kenyans need food. There, of course, we have forgotten about drought-resistant crops in the last couple of years, because we have embraced quite the new technology and crops that really need a lot of water. And in your research, you're talking about African indigenous vegetables. Where are we? Do we really need to refocus our energies on genetically modified foods?
Thank you so much. I think from where I sit, genetically modified food, they have their place to, they have a part to play, but as we speak now, as you've mentioned, most of these high technology packed crops like the GMOs, they need a lot of inputs, a lot of water, a lot of fertilizer and so on. They come as a package. But then we know that Africa and Kenya has been endowed with a lot of African indigenous foods, not just vegetables. We have the cereals, we have the pulses, we have the root crops, some of which are very adapted to the area and they are resilient. So I think from where I sit, we should put enough emphasis on what we already have. They always say it's better the devil, the angel you don't know. As we bring in these GMOs, let's exploit first what we have, because we have many of these indigenous foods if not harnessed, they will disappear. And we know that from historical, if we go back to history, many of our great-grandfathers never suffered drought, never suffered hunger or anything, because they were using these drought-resistant crops naturally. Of course, we have those drought-resistant crops which are coming up as hybrids, but now these particular ones have the inbuilt ability to withstand drought and to be able to even to be stored. So as a country, as a people, we should now try to salvage the little African indigenous food that we have. And from where I sit, my research has shown that actually we have a lot of like African indigenous vegetables which are very resilient, very nutritious, and they have a lot of advantages in terms of nutrition. So I would urge us as a people, as the government of Kenya and people from Kenya and Africa, we should look at what we have, because you see, every country or every continent has its advantages. So let's take advantage of our niche, because we don't have to take everything that's coming from the international community or conventional. Let's see what we have at our table. We'll start with what we have, and then we can bring in others just to fill the gap. Yes. All
right. And Mary, you will be telling us a little bit on after you, because mostly your role is more on advisory. This is going to happen. This is going to happen. So what do we do after that? Your advisory role, vis-a-vis what government agencies should do. We are looking at the drought situation in the country. What is latest is that the head of state yesterday, Dr. William Ruto, at State House Nairobi, did flag off over 50 trucks that will be going to at least 10 counties which are hard hit by the drought situation in the country. And it's not only 10 counties, those are just the counties that are in dire need of food reserves, but we have 23 counties that are also on the red, and that is what we are discussing here. And to help me drive that conversation, we have Professor Mary Abukhutsa, who is an agricultural research scientist and also a lecturer at the Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology. And we also have Mary Kilavi, who is an assistant director at the Kenya Meteorological Department. Ladies, after that, the crossing over to check what else is happening in the country, we were looking at the Kenya Meteorological Department. Partly most of what you forecast largely goes into what happens. And more or less, it's more or less like an advisory role, because you do not say we are going to be having the short rains which are going to be very much suppressed, and this is what we are going to do, because there are other government agencies that are mandated to do that. Your advisory role, vis-a-vis what happens after you've advised the government or stakeholders in regards to what? Because for now you have clearly indicated that we are going to be having short rains which will be quite short. Mary.
Yes. So because we recognize that we do not have all the knowledge that is required for the kind of action that needs to be taken. So what we've been doing, especially quite lately, is to work quite closely with the different agencies that are mandated with disaster risk reduction in their various sectors. So when we're releasing the forecast, we actually come together in a forum and we discuss, and we look at the forecast, and for the various sectors we do what is now commonly called co-production. So we look at the impacts, the expected impacts in the various sectors, and out of that then the sectors are able to actually come up with advisory that is dependent on the expected rainfall.
And the latest report where you say that we are going to be having suppressed rainfalls in our short rain season, what are some of the emerging issues that came up during the last meeting that you talked about?
Yes, of course, one that is really key, especially going by what is happening right now, is that the current drought in terms of food security and water availability is expected to actually deteriorate. And hence, it's really important that the government does what is actually doing right now to continue with food relief and other measures to mitigate the impacts and to prevent whatever extent a loss of lives. For the health sector, with reduced rainfall, then hygiene issues are likely, a reduced amount of water, health issues are likely to arise, and there's the chance that some communicable diseases there could be an upsurge of such, like dysentery and maybe amoeba and several other diseases that come due to insufficient amount of water for hygiene purposes. Yes.
Prof, looking at the season that we are headed to, going to be having suppressed rates. I cannot re-emphasize that enough. But looking at the solutions that we have here in Africa, the war in Ukraine has exposed something that a lot of Kenyans and perhaps a Horn of Africa, the 36 million who are facing starvation in the Horn of Africa, didn't know, is that we do import a lot of wheat, a lot of maize, a lot of soya. Basically, we are importing a lot of foodstuffs, and anything happens, for example, the war that is there, the high food prices and the high fuel prices are only exacerbating the situation. What are some of the homegrown solutions that we can have?
Okay, thank you very much for that question. I want to emphasize the point that in Africa, in Kenya, we have advantages, or we have some of the solutions that we can use, what you have just called homegrown solutions. One of them is that we have to look at ways in which we can improve production of the key foodstuffs, like the ones we've mentioned, like the maize. But instead of rice and wheat, we can now start emphasizing the production of other starchy foods that are indigenous to Africa. I want to talk about millet, I want to talk about sorghums, I want to talk about beans, bambara nuts, and those are foods that are actually not just resilient in terms of production, but they are very highly nutritious. For example, if you take like bambara nut, it's a nut that is described as a whole food. So we need to look at the whole list of all the indigenous foods that we have, and a lot of research has been done on this. Calro has done a lot of research, universities have done this work. It's just now working with, like Mary said, working with other stakeholders, the government, other maybe NGOs, and work together that we position these plans on the table. They are being produced. We have to actually have advocacy, and of course the media have an important part to play, telling people that don't just grow maize. If the rains are going to take 2 months, like we've been told, or instead of just growing maize, grow these other options, and the options are there, as I said, from vegetables to cereals to pulses like the legumes. And I think what we actually need is just advocacy and re-educating the farmers, so that they are not just focused. We also, in the same breath, I want to say that we need to re-educate our people in the consumption preferences. People just want to eat ugali every day. Ugali is not the only food. Sometimes there are some places you cannot grow maize, but people keep on growing maize. Now that we've been told that we cannot grow maize because of the short, why can't we grow this other? Why can't we grow potatoes? We have potatoes that can be ready. These are the sweet potatoes, can be ready within a month or two. So we need to just tell them that this is just as good food as maize. So that's what I think, some of the things that we need, the low hanging fruits that we can take advantage of in the short term as we approach this period of short rains that will be decreased.
All right. We're talking about more or less climate change in the bigger picture, because that is more or less what has led us to what we are discussing today. That is the drought situation in the country, and more or less in the Horn of Africa, where 36 million Africans and 4 million Kenyans are in dire need of food in the country. And the president did flag off 50 trucks yesterday, and today is holding a cabinet meeting that we are keeping a keen eye on. We'll be coming with much more details on that as soon as we get there. But back to a topic of discussion now. And to you, Mary, what can we, the uptakes in terms of what we have been able to, as a meteorological department, what can we pick out from exactly what you always tell us to do? Because more or less it's an advisory as you noted out, is more or less an advisory advice.
Yes. So in addition to the short-term predictions that like right now we are looking at, we also look a little further into climate change, what is expected. We also keep an eye on what is already happening. And this far, the globe has actually warmed to about 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial period. And this is mainly what is responsible for the extreme events that we are experiencing. We have seen in just the last few months how Europe has been suffering from, extreme heat.
Yeah, the heat wave.
The heat waves really are quite unprecedented. We are now seeing this prolonged drought. And in other parts of the world, we've seen Pakistan, the flooding that was happening just a few weeks ago. And indeed, this is a signature of climate change, the major way in which it manifests itself, that in terms of the degree rise in temperature may not look that significant. For example, we are sitting here, if it rises from 25 degrees to 26 degrees, we may not quite realize or really feel it. But the major impact of the mean change in temperature across the globe is actually what now we're beginning to experience, much more frequent and intense extreme events. So we are beginning to realize much longer droughts that are more intense, and the kind of flooding that we are seeing in other parts of the world. So that is what is happening now, so which means we are beginning to really feel the heat of climate change in the sense that we're experiencing much more intense extreme events. And that is actually what is expected. It's expected to only get worse in the future. Our projections are showing that at least by 2040, we are likely going to get to the dreaded 1.5 degrees Celsius, rise above the pre-industrial times. And that is only going to make things worse. So it means we really need to brace up for the warmer climate and the more extreme events that are going to be more intense and more frequent in the future.
Indeed, Prof, what Mary is talking about could be would disturb our minds in terms of what we are expecting in the coming days. We are getting more advanced, but unfortunately, the technology that we have, we are not quite using it to mitigate climate change or even drought situation in the country. What are some of the technological advancement that can help to sort out this? And also, you've worked on 9 varieties of African indigenous vegetables. You can tell us something about that, which could help in the food sufficiency in the country.
Okay, thank you very much. First and foremost, with regard to technology, the information that we get from Meteorological, like the way it has been articulated by Mary, we find that the scientists or researchers are looking at ways in which you can improve production, what we are calling climate smart production. And there's a lot of programs that we are carrying out with CALRO to come up with ways in which we can do production to avoid or to be able to adjust to the changing climate. So the technologies are coming up in terms of how do we produce the food in a particular way, in such a way that it grows very faster. We have technologies, of course, they are not widespread, but the technologies especially attractive to the youth. Like when you talk about greenhouse technology, which we can control the environment. We have also soilless cultures where you do production, especially the short-term crops. So the technologies are coming to help us in the long run to deal with the problem of climate change. And then, as I said earlier, we are looking at also at varieties that are that grow faster and mature faster, so that we are able to get produce or harvest before the deleterious effects of climate affect the produce. Then when we come to the varieties like I mentioned earlier, we have actually a rich resource in agricultural biodiversity, indigenous foods, and so on. Just as an example, my area is African indigenous vegetables. What we've done is actually not to develop new hybrids, but we have taken what we have in Kenya and in Africa. We did some collections in collaboration with the international, like the World Vegetable Center in Arusha and in Taiwan. We looked at these varieties from Africa of vegetables, described them, and analyzed them in terms of nutrition, in terms of resilience, in terms of economic importance, and we came up with 9 varieties. These varieties, actually, we have like Managu, we have 3 varieties, we have Saga, 2 varieties, we have Mrenda, 2 varieties, and then vine spinach, which is Derema, 2 varieties. These varieties are there, and actually we've been trying to see how to popularize them. We have been sharing with the farmers all over Kenya, giving them part of the varieties, because these are not new varieties. We are just cleaning them and giving them agronomic practice so that they can be produced in an optimal way. So these varieties actually are, we are working closely with the seed companies so that they can become available. But normally you will want to see, is it acceptable? Because you see most of these indigenous vegetables per se, they are found in particular areas. But we want to make these not just national crops, national veg, but international. We are even going to exploit the international trade in terms of diaspora. They are actually asking for these varieties so that we can export them and get money. So as an example, I know Carlo is working on indigenous fruits. They are working on indigenous root crops. They are working on indigenous cereals and indigenous pulses. So if we can put this together in a structured way, I know that we can be able to deal with this issue of climate change to some extent, so that the effect is not that serious.
And of course, we were getting to how the youth can be engaged because they have the biggest manpower. But Mary, whatever Professor Mary is talking about is quite valid, looking at how we can switch from more or less rain-fed agriculture to greenhouses, which could also increase the food sufficiency in the country. But there have also been concerns raised in terms of the greenhouses emissions.
Yeah, sure. So whatever practices that we adopt, we have to also be very careful that we are also not increasing our emissions. Of course, Africa has not been responsible for much of the warming, and for some reason, a lot of the developing countries argue that they should be allowed to develop a little with a bit of emissions. But we have a responsibility at individual, at the country level, to make sure that we are not making it worse through whatever practices we decide to adopt. Yes,
but I'm quite sure now Kenyans are looking for, there are some Kenyans who just are looking for food, not a balanced diet. They just first of all tell you, just give me food, whether balanced or not. Mary, looking at the youth, we have seen the youth actually indulge into technology and more or less in agriculture. How can we harness this to ensure that maybe we are mitigating some of the climate change situations that we are in, and also ensuring that we are also getting something on our plates?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think when you come to the youth, first and foremost, I think we know that Kenya and Africa has the highest percentage of the youth. And this youth, if they are well harnessed, they can contribute to the food situation, food security and nutrition in Kenya and even beyond. And I want to say that coming from an agricultural university, we have many of our youth who are coming up with technologies and innovations that can contribute significantly to the production of some of these foods, so they can serve us as a food. So one of the things that I know is that many of the youth in the first instance sometimes are not interested in doing courses in agriculture. One, because they think that they have that mentality of the traditional farmer. But then with the advent of new technologies, like we are talking about using smartphones to relay information, looking at, for example, just recently one of our students came up with what we call a robot weeder, a technology where that that particular machine can be able to differentiate between a weed and a cabbage and so on. So given a chance, actually they have that mindset where they can come with technologies that can help us to come up with smart farming, smart agriculture that can also help in terms of production. So we need to pay a special focus on the youth so that we harness their inventive spirit or mind and the technology focused kind of attention, so that they can also contribute, so that they can complement what other the traditional farmers are doing, the government is doing, and even other stakeholders are doing. Yes.
Mary, you are the weather woman that we have today, so I'm going to ask these questions. What lessons can we learn from countries like Israel and the Gulf nations? We are talking about 36 million Africans in the Horn of Africa who are in dire need of food. But incidentally, Israel and the Gulf, the climate there, vis-a-vis what we have here in the country, is quite different. But they have mastered the agriculture art to the point that they are even giving us food, despite the fact that they are in the real desert themselves.
Yeah, it's quite a contrast. And indeed, there's quite a lot to learn from, because what they do is to actually maximize.
I'm quite sure they listen to their weather men and women.
Yes, they maximize on the resources that they have, actually really optimize. For example, in Israel, I think much of the water is drawn from the Lake of Galilee, what we read about in the Bible. And that is sufficient. In addition to the little rainfall that they get, they harness that and they optimize it such that almost everything that's grown, any tree that you see even in the street, is actually irrigated in an optimal way to minimize loss. So that's something that I think we
and
could
recycling
really,
water as well.
Yeah, and recycling too. So that's something that we could learn from. We have a lot more water. We have many more resources. We actually have much more rainfall. So if only we optimized what we have, we wouldn't have to get into the situation that we are in. So it's about planning how to actually optimize on the resources that we have, and of course making use of the climate information to plan.
Indeed. And Prof, I saw you nodding, and I'm going to pose the same question to you. What are some of the lessons that we can learn from such countries like Israel and the Gulf nations, where they are in the middle of the desert, yet they are able to provide sufficient foods for their citizens, and not only that, they end up giving us some relief foods as well in the Horn of Africa?
Like what Mayor has said, I think Israel and the Gulf, they have planned, and they are invested a lot in irrigated agriculture technology, because it's actually where you need to put money in it. If, for example, if Kenya can invest in irrigated agriculture, even in the northeastern and the ASAL areas, we can be able to produce